Hey everybody, my name is Kyler Flock and I'm the Community Engagement Manager here at the Matthews Opera House, and I want to welcome all of our viewers and listeners back to our third edition of our Bellman Brown Bag podcast series. So the pandemic, with the state that it's still in, we're going to keep bringing you the excitement of our Bellmans through this format so it can just be listened to from the safety of your own homes. And today, we really have an amazing guest here with us today. Our special guest today is the Sanford Underground Research Facility's first ever artist in residency. She's a professor of digital communications at Black Hills State University and a longtime good friend of the Matthews Opera House, Gina Gibson. Today, Gina and I are going to be discussing her recent art exhibit through the Sanford Underground Research Facility, her residency program, and so much more. So I hope everybody enjoys the episode. Thank you. So for all our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in to our third podcast that the Matthews has worked on. Today, you're getting to see an even better version through Zoom. And I'm here with our special guest, Gina Gibson. Gina, thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me.
And just to kind of clarify with everyone else, for anyone who doesn't know, Gina was the first artist in residency with the Sanford Underground Research Facility, or SURF, as we will be calling it. And so today we're just going to be discussing her residency, some of the works that came with it, and just residencies and art as a whole. So to kind of kick things off, Gina, do you want to sort of tell us how you were introduced to the Underground Research Facility and, how basically this whole residency conversation blossomed?
Sure. I should say that I am originally from North Carolina. So I moved to Spearfish, South Dakota in 2008. So I didn't have an understanding of the area as far as I didn't know the history of homestake. I didn't know about the Sanford Lab. And the Sanford Lab was actually sort of begun like officially around the same time that I moved here. So I kind of knew it was there once I got here and started teaching, but I didn't know a lot about it. So fast forward to 2013, and I was invited to participate in a show called Into the Dark, Artists Exploring Dark Matter. So there were about 20 South Dakota artists that were invited to visit the lab and go underground and make a piece of artwork for a group exhibition that explored this concept of dark matter, which was this challenge. So my work, I'm kind of interested in science in the sense of I'm a curious person, so I get excited about everything. But it wasn't like that specific. It wasn't like dark matter. So I would definitely say that most artists probably ask those big questions at some point, like, where are we from? What does this mean? But to go to the lab and be a part of that show really was challenging in a way that piqued my curiosity. And so in 2013, like I said, I joined that exhibition, and then it traveled, and I started looking at other science facilities and residency programs because I knew that I was interested in that aspect. And oddly enough, it wasn't until around spring of 2019 that it finally occurred to me that, wait, SURF is still here. So it kind of worked out that I had simultaneously this idea. They were already looking into what it would be to have an artist in residence. So it just worked.
Right.
And I kept in touch with SURF throughout those years by working with education outreach and other parts of SURF with my students. So and I had students that were interns. So the relationship between BHSU and SURF was part of the reason that I just kept sort of floating in and out, so to speak.
Yeah. And so, you mentioned, 2013 and sort of your first emergence with SURF. Now, prior to that, had you done anything like doing a exhibition based on science, or was that part of it just as new as, working with this crazy underground research facility?
I had work that was about symmetry and about, I guess I would say some of the work has verged on math and science. From an aesthetic standpoint, I love pattern. I'm very interested in pattern. I'm very interested in repetition. The cosmos, which sounds lofty, but it's true. I can't remember a point in my life where I wasn't startled by the sunset and color and light. So I think a lot of artists experience science probably just by their senses, and they sit and they think and they're curious. So I think that part of it was in me, but I hadn't directed it. I mean, it was more like tangential. It was sort of like, but this was more like, okay, we're going down this path.
Yeah. And so all of these different, and I wanted to ask one other thing in 2013. With this exhibition, there were multiple artists, right? So you sort of got to meet a community of other artists who are willing to explore does that help too when you've got, when you're not by yourself, sort of when you did the residency? Did it help having a little bit of a community of artists thinking about this?
It was fascinating, actually. I had no idea. I had looked up most of the folks that, if I didn't know their work already, I looked up what they were doing. And I thought, well, what are they going to do? So I found some people did sculptures I wouldn't have expected, and some photography. I mean, people just did things that I was just like, ooh. And, there were limitations. The exhibition had scale limitations. There were several things, which kind of helps as an artist if it has to fit this size, it has to do this thing, and it's going to be a part of a group. It's different. It's kind of like getting homework. So.
Right. Now, okay, so you do the exhibition in 2013, sort of gets the wheel spinning about this sort of, science and arts world emerging. Would you say that is sort of what then really ignited you to apply, or actually even further back, did you have to apply for this residency with the Underground Research Facility, or did they approach you and say, hey, we loved what went down in 2013, can we expand?
It was sort of it was sort of simultaneously happening. Like I said, I've had a conversation with the lab for years. So I think that because I already had a relationship with the lab and had students work with them, and so many, just like NBH is involved, Black Hills State, it just seemed natural that I was looking for an opportunity. I was planning to apply to Fermilab and CERN and other places. So I was really just reading a lot about what was out there, which I'd been doing for years. So it just seemed natural, and the timing worked out. So with the lab, I had this opportunity to do this first run, which was, it's always interesting to be like the first person to do something to its full circle here. And, of course, as we talk in this conversation, we'll bring up things that happened that changed what I thought the outcomes of that experience would be, such as COVID and other things. So, the expectations were really kind of like laid out early in the conversations with the lab, where I would produce artwork and it would be a part of Neutrino Day about a year later. So just kind of an interesting, went all over the place. It worked out, I think, and the physical art show hasn't happened yet. So at some point, all the folks listening, hopefully you'll get to see the work in person, because I really enjoyed making it. So I look forward to people seeing it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, just for myself and the listeners, could you sort of break down this term residency kind of as a whole, before we really dive into your first residency with SURF? What is that? What does a residency really mean, especially for an artist like yourself?
Sure. So if you think about the root word reside, so if you think about this idea of you go somewhere to stay and kind of make a home for a period, some residency programs last 2 weeks and others last a year. So facilities like the National Park Service, like I mentioned, CERN, and Fermilab, these are places that are also related to science. They have, established residency programs where they invite people that may think differently. I'm gonna kind of argue this in a moment.
Mm,
That may think differently because it is those are those interactions between different fields that often there's excitement. I mean, I think there's much more interdisciplinary work happening than we really want to, like, we might have trouble thinking about. Whether it's textiles interacting with the space program. I mean, there are creative people constantly making work that relates to these other fields like science and engineering. And it's not that those aren't creative, because I think a lot of times we'll go, artists are creative, scientists are analytical.
mm,
There's a little like
not.
there's a merging, like there are plenty of analytical artists and scientists that are super creative. And so I think we have to be careful when we draw lines like, oh, artists do these things, because I don't fit those things every time, just by the media I work in. So I think it's really fun to watch in a facility like SURF or even the National Park Service or some of these places that specialize in opening the door to people from the outside to go in and say, here's what I saw and here's why it was interesting. And I produced things that were inspired by that experience.
I see. Okay. I really love that idea though, especially what you were saying about how we have this notion of science is the analytics and the artists are, more the creative force. But I'm sure as we keep talking that we're gonna find that you found that it's really all pretty blurred together, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. And like speaking to that, was there any nerves for you as someone who, may not have the science background that some of the colleagues you were, was that ever a factor or what are those thoughts like on those still talking in these early days before the residencies really,
Sure.
exploring?
I guess I could talk a little bit about my process, like how I work. So I teach at Black Hill State. I'm a professor. And I know you mentioned that, but I think that that kind of relates to kind of how I am. I'm kind of bookish.
Mm,
So
mm-hmm,
I have a tendency to read a lot before, or at least try to research as much as I can before I do anything. So before I even went underground, this most recent, for this year, not in 2013, but the more current, I spent a lot of time reading about the history of homestake, so I understood that with more depth, kind of pun intended.
in depth,
I
nice.
wanted to understand, I can't help it. I wanted to understand more about the science, and I really did feel like there was sort of a learning curve there, that same challenge of how do I visualize something we haven't seen, like dark matter. I mean, to say, how am I going to learn enough of the history of physics specifically to understand this space that I'm going into? I wanted to do that out of respect too. I also tried to learn as much as I could about the history of the area in a broader way, like the Native American connection. There were so many things that I wanted to pay absolute respect to. And I think the word is respect.
Mm,
I knew that as an artist, I had this opportunity to not only make visuals, but to also have a voice. And I think whenever you have voice, you have to choose what you say. So I feel like my residency opportunity has been a year of me saying, what's important about this place and to me, because obviously my perspective is different.
mm-hmm.
But then I was so touched by the people I was interacting with. So there's approximately a mile long cage ride underground, which is a pretty complicated elevator system. Um, and on my first ride underground, or one of my first rides, I was standing, or I was about walking with, and then standing inside the cage with one of the principal investigators for the Dune experiment, which is being built currently at the Sanford Lab site. So I'm standing there. She said, "So are you a scientist?" And I said, "No, I'm an artist." So this was one of those moments where I knew that I was standing next to someone that, she was also a professor. So I said, "Well,
Mm-hmm.
I also teach." So we had a conversation, and everybody I interacted with seemed very interested in, well, what are you going to make?
Mm.
So it was just, what are you going to do? And I'm like, well, I'm just collecting right now. So,
Oh.
I was collecting. So I was collecting photographs and sketches and writing things and ideas. And so my first few months at the lab, I just spent collecting and I was reading. So I would call it the absorption period, like just grab everything I can, and I mean literally pile things up.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
That's you mentioned something in particular that I really wanted to kind of further. I like that. So would you say that I almost get this sense that you're saying there is this really strong power to a residency, and you sort of hold this power of, how do I want to portray this facility, like, so I really applaud that like you were able to actually take the time to do the research and were understanding of how significant this residency program could be. I'm sure that was kind of the maybe the most intense part of the process was just those first. Did you ever feel overwhelmed at first? What was that first time like going down into the lab?
there's quite a bit of safety training. So from a
Mm,
physical point of view, I felt pretty secure. Um, and it was the mental, I will admit the weight of what I wanted to talk about was heavy almost the
mm,
entire time. I feel sort of a sense of responsibility, but I do that as an educator too. I just feel like I feel very privileged and lucky to do the things I do anyway. And in general, like in life. So
mm,
I think I approach the residency in the same way. I remember meeting individual people. Some of the folks I interacted with worked during homestake. So they were still here or back, more correctly back, because there was a period where the space was not being used at all. So I met people who met, like Ray Davis is a famous physicist that is probably the reason, like in many ways, that the facility was viewed as a place for deep underground research. But that's a whole other talk.
mhm,
So I met people who interacted with folks that I looked at and read about them, and I thought, oh, this person came to the homestake, company or something. We don't know the whole narrative, or at least I don't, and said, hey, I want to do research and I want to research neutrinos. So I wonder in some ways if it's not as abstract when
mm.
we say as artists, I want to make artwork about this thing that appears unrelated, but I think they are related. So I think that's kind of a fascinating way to perceive it as an artist. Like, you go into spaces or just in your own space. Some artists work very internally, and you make these things that don't exist otherwise without you making them. So kind of a remarkable privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying. I feel like it's really giving the listeners a true sense of like that feeling of a residency and that power and just the uniqueness of it of, hey, I'm in this space and now it's my job to sort of portray what this time was like. Is that sort of right? Is that kind of the idea, I guess, in a real simplistic sort of way to put it?
And as COVID changed my perceptions as well. A dear friend pointed out, because I was sending just a few close people, close friends. I sent them like versions of things as I was making them. And
Mm-hmm.
one friend, I remember when I finished the hand that's behind me, or at least it was pretty far along, and she said, I wonder if you wouldn't have made a hand if it hadn't been for COVID. Because this idea of touch, suddenly it wasn't okay to touch, like it wasn't okay to hug, it wasn't, so many things were taken in a physical way that I think making a hand that's 4 feet wide made sense suddenly. And I don't know that I would have made that, because this was a piece that was a square first, and it looked like a stained glass piece, because I had all these mirrored images, because I'm again interested in repetition, pattern, and all this stuff from a purely art standpoint. I just love what happens when things get mirrored,
Mm,
and reflections. But this piece didn't make sense anymore like that, so it just shifted it.
yeah.
um,
Did you feel the whole this is sort of a two-parter question, but did you feel that the whole process changed post COVID? And I guess how invested were you into your research when COVID became sort of real, as we keep saying, sort of that late March, April period? Where were you at in your process pre-COVID?
so I had been at the lab since summer of 2019. So I had visited, I went underground a handful of times at that point, maybe a little more. And I had collected materials. And the last time that I went to the site to collect more materials was, I want to say late 2019. So I spent maybe early 2020. So I was collecting, and then I've scanned quite a bit. Like I even took a flatbed scanner underground one time because some items couldn't be removed from the space
Oh,
for various
right.
reasons. So I took a flatbed scanner, and it's one of my favorite ways to capture items, and I used a camera as well. So it really is like a collection. I also had this wonderful experience of having an opportunity to get images of bacteria because Dr. David Bergman, who teaches at Black Hill State, happened to be underground one day, and he didn't know I was doing this, and we ran into each other of all things. Like, can you imagine running into somebody you don't expect? And there's only not that many
Underground.
at the time. Yeah. And he said, Gina? And I said, David? So I said, what do you do? And he said, I'm collecting bacteria. And I was like, you have bacteria with you right now? And he's like, yeah, right here in my bag. And I was like, is that safe? I mean, that literally was, it was a wonderful exchange. And he offered to show. So I went to his lab, and we took the time to look at images, and I collected more images, and he explained like why this looks like a crystal and why this looks like hair or spaghetti, or I mean, it was just fascinating. So unexpected experiences happened above ground as well as below ground. Most of them seem to start underground though, because it's just such an unusual thing to do. So I collected images over all those months, and the bacteria images, if somebody goes to my website, seekingtheunseen.com, you'll see that many of the images, I'll just in the description, bacteria from the 4850 level, which 4850 refers to how many feet underground. So there are these references, and Dr. David Bergman was nice enough to work with me. The really funny thing is when you work with a print shop and you say, hey, can you print this bacteria for me? So it ends up being really a fun experience. And I had already started that as well. I had started working with Simpson's Printing in Rapid City, and we had been doing test prints on different materials. Like behind me is acrylic, and then there's metal. So we were just trying all these things, and what happens when it's see-through, what happens when you do this, and how do you hang it? Like it was just, I was pretty far into it. And I had done some work with fine art papers, and one of my colleagues, Scott Chandler at BHS, she had worked with me on printing. I mean, I had this wonderful net, like I should say, I did not do this by myself. It took like a village for me to make an art show. So without all these wonderful people, and the same with surf, it's not like I walked in, there was this collaborative nature and openness. The town of Lead, I visited, everything in Lead over and over again, and people got to know me. So they were like, what are you doing? And like, I'd show them pictures of my artwork, like from the past, or maybe some in process, just so they get a sense of what I'm doing. And I met scientists and engineers at the lab who loaned me like cable slices. That's what the hand is full of. See, I'm telling a secret. So I know you shouldn't tell all your secrets, right? So these are small cable slices that I scanned at a very high resolution, so they could be expanded to 4 times the size of your head. So yeah, it just, without those people, this work wouldn't have happened.
Right. And do you feel like, had you not, missed out on those early days because of COVID, do you feel like that sense of collaboration could have potentially been lost? Because it actually kind of seems like timing wise, you were at least able to get a lot of the collaborative stuff done before you knew that the world would, kind of stop for a little while.
Every art show I've ever had, there is a collection period. And I knew that I was at the end of that because I was running out of time to actually make the work. So I tell my students, and it is true, I have to give myself deadlines and homework because I will let it drag on forever. So if I don't have an art show, put the date on the calendar. I will drag it, I will agonize, I will over obsess, I do all of that. So I have to have deadlines. Luckily, I knew Neutrino Day was the deadline. So Neutrino Day was scheduled for July. So July 2020, I had in my mind this big, Neutrino Day was going to be a physical art show, a physical presence in lead. With my goal was approximately 20 art pieces. So I like gave myself my homework assignment, like, Gina, you have to finish these pieces by this date. So as I worked with Simpsons, which were wonderful.
We're going to get into that for sure.
Yes. And I was already talking to frame shops. There was just all this communication going on. I had that as my deadline. Now, because of COVID, suddenly we went from art show that's going to be physical to physical pieces as well as a digital or a virtual art show. Now that kind of was just like, oh no, I got to build a website. So I knew suddenly a lot of my creative energy that was going to just be art, just framing, printing, whatever it is, just producing, turned into I have a website to build. I have to make sure it functions. I have to make sure people can click through. How do I say thank you to people? Like, how do I write the artist statement so that it's cohesive? And for someone who didn't know the space, that was a concern for me. Like, how do I tell someone who just goes to my website enough for them to appreciate it? I mean, I'm not going to give them the history of everything, but enough for them to say, okay, I want to know more about that. And then they can either contact me or learn more by, reading or whatever it is.
Right.
So yeah, it changed a lot.
Now, I know, a really important part of the whole process for you was your deep talk that you gave. Where were you at in your deep talk with the process, and where was COVID during that? Like, I'm curious where those three things sort of line up, like your game plan, the deep talk, and COVID sort of.
So I love the deep talks anyway. So the Sanford Lab has this series of basically people come and talk about cool things during the winter months. And I would highly encourage people to check that out. It's, I believe they're all virtual currently. Just way cool. So I was already kind of like beyond ecstatic that I was going to get to do a deep talk anyway. I view the deep talk as, and I kind of like giving talks. So part of the reason I like giving a talk is because it forces me to clearly state what I am doing for other people. Now that means I have to be able to clearly state it for myself, because the only way you can show other people something is if you understand it fully. So I had to clarify, like, why was I interested? What's a residency? What are things that are grabbing my attention, while not showing any of the work? Because we wanted to, like, this was a discussion I had with the lab. We wanted to keep that sort of this exciting, like, come to this deep talk, and then it gets people interested in coming to the art show. So that was February. I believe it was February 13th. So I gave this talk. There were over 100 people in attendance. It was fun. I felt awesome. I was elated. I had this fun experience of talking about this cool thing I'd been doing for a while. And I had, it was kind of my opportunity to tell my physics and engineering friends, here's why I think you guys are so awesome. So it was a real compliment, because so many of them came and actually gave me feedback and talked to me about, what grabbed their attention. And, I think the best compliment I got from several compliments that just really touched me. One was, I'm going to go underground tomorrow and I'm not going to see it the same way anymore. So, so that to me as an artist, if I can say, hey, I think this place is amazing. And somebody say, oh, I have a different point of view. Not to say that my point of view is the only one or the correct one, but just what a gift to be able to talk to people and them tell me things and me learn, which I loved. Like, I've had so many conversations about neutrinos and just stuff that I didn't even know what the words meant a few years ago. So
Right. I um I love that idea too, that like that quote you said of how you literally, the talk itself gave a whole new room, a different perspective. Was that your first time able to publicly discuss what was going on with your residency? Like how much of that in those early days are kept private?
I think some of it is just I was too busy collecting to really even
Mm,
analyze what was going on. I know that I talked about it a little bit with my students on campus, mostly because I would just be thinking about it. So,
mhm.
I'd walk in and I'd say, "Oh, I spent all last night reading this or looking at that," and I'd say, "Do you guys know like you can learn things that are really really outside of what you think your discipline is?"
Mm,
And I had a chance to um, interact with so many people that thought so differently, like fundamentally differently. At least that's what it seemed like for me, in the sense of I really had to figure out what they were saying at times. And I would just ask, like, I wasn't embarrassed to say, "Can you go back a few steps? Why would matter work that way? What, wait, why does that happen? What do you mean time does it this way?" Like questions that I think they were just happy to talk about the things they loved, just like I love talking about art. So if somebody talks to me about process or aesthetics, or I mean, I'm happy to talk about it. So it was the same way. It was a very delightful two-way street. I never
mm.
felt like people were just sort of like, "Oh, you're an artist." It never felt like that.
And I'm sure that makes, a world of difference doing any residency, just being able to like communicate questions and concerns and have that sort of back and forth. Okay, so we do the deep talk. It goes well. Now, after that deep talk, is that when you really started actually putting, which by the way, I will, for all the listeners out there, I will be attaching the links so you can actually go look at Gina's show right now, currently on the website. Now, after that detox, is that really when you sit down and solidify what's going to be in your Neutrino Day show?
It was when I knew I had to start making some solid decisions about what needed to be printed, particularly because just from a timeline. So that was February. I knew I had March, April, May, June, July. I had 4 to 5 months to go back and forth with the print shop, which was a lot of my and I was working on campus a little bit printing, and I had various things that I was working on. So I wasn't sure what was going to work. So I should make that clear. It wasn't like, oh, I had a vision and it came together. That is not at all how my process works. It is, I make a lot of things that are hard to look at that I don't want to show anybody. And then every once in a while, something goes, "Oh, okay, I'm going to stop right now and I'm going to look at that. That's okay."
Mm,
So there was a lot of artwork that was just not anywhere I'd want to show it to people. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't reapproach some of that when I have a different idea, or like, for example, the cable slices inside the hand. Although I liked that piece a little bit, I wasn't like, "Wow, that piece is so resolved. It's so brilliant." I didn't feel that way at all. I looked at that piece and I went, "It's okay." So I think that a lot of my work falls into the "I'm not sure about it" category. And it's not until suddenly something clicks and then I feel like, "Oh, it pulled together visually." Um, so
so it's sort of, so I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like, which is really fun for me to hear, because of all the times you and I have talked, I've never actually asked about your process with any art you do. Would you say that stays true for most of your works, where it's just you kind of get into this period of I'm just going to produce, observe and pick and choose? Has that always been the Gina process, or was that something that emerged from this specific residency?
it's been my process as long as I can remember making things. So
That's cool. That's
I have
cool.
to make like I'm the phrase I usually use is I have to make 100 ugly things to get to the 20 okay things. Like it really is a huge amount of stuff that is hard to look at. And I don't use the word
Mm,
ugly lightly. I just mean some of it is visually difficult to deal with. So,
mm,
and I think that that's something I admit to myself openly, that when something clicks and I don't know what it is, I can't there. I can literally name like days where I feel like multiple pieces were just like on, like almost like,
Mm-hmm.
I think I have friends that are writers that say it's the same thing with writing. Like they'll have just like somehow they'll write. They can write every day, but they'll have a couple of days where like, wow. Or musicians, like I think, I don't know what it is about the creative process. I just know I have to make stuff. It's not like I'm going to get to those magic days and I can avoid the rest of the time. That's not how it works. I have to have all that dragging myself through the work that doesn't work. And some of the work that doesn't work eventually works. So it kind of just hangs out. Unless I discard it, which does happen occasionally. I know some people are going to go, no, but I do occasionally discard work. If I didn't, my whole house would be full of artwork. But,
This is really, this is going to be, I think, really cool to hear for any young creators out there, knowing that whatever the thing is that you're doing, it just sounds like don't give up and continue the process, and things will start to click as you go along. Because like you said, whether you're a writer, musician, I sort of hear that same thing, that you sort of wake up with that need to get it out, but it's not always going to be the one that's going to be hanging in the pristine gallery. You mentioned printing, and something I need to address, or just have a ton of curious thoughts about, is this is it Simpsons, this printing company?
yes.
Okay, like, I guess for starters, what are they? Can you give us just a little bit about what it is like there and what they work with? Because it's hard for me to fathom this printing company in Rapid that's able to produce this giant hand that's right behind you that
I
our
know, and the
viewers
sunlight's
can
coming in,
see.
beaming on it. You got
It
these.
is, yeah,
So
yeah. Look at that.
Simpsons printing, this is another one of those. I've been around a while and I know
Mm,
people because of it. So I've known Simpsons since around the time I got here. And they've always just been really open and helpful with students and involved. And I knew that they could do metal printing, which is why I approached them. I saw a group of pieces on campus that were actually images from the Sanford lab. Steve Babbitt, who's a professor at Black Hills State, years ago went to surf, and during the transition and building out and all this stuff, he did this wonderful series of images, of photographs that were that captured the spaces, the light, and just wonderful. So several of those, as well as Matt Kappist, he works at the lab. They have captured the visuals. So there are these metal prints both at the lab and at BH that I just kept going, man, those are so cool. And I thought, and I printed on metal small scale in the past. So, and I mean postcard size, small scale.
oh.
And I had friends that had printed on metal. And I started to think about industrial materials in relation to the lab, because I thought, and this might sound a little lofty, but how do I make old? I knew some of the themes that I kind of had in my head, old and new, because I kept thinking, old, and I thought about like this historical like space, and physically literal like things that are older, rusty, and then I thought about this newness with this idea of this science that's pushing, like really pushing the envelope, and it's very adventurous, and it's like totally looking in the future. So I was like, how do I talk about this place? And I started thinking about materials. So some of the images you'll see on the website, and as well in person at some point, I collected some physical materials because I do have a history of working with found object, and I scanned some materials. And when I went to Simpsons, I kind of said, I'm not sure what I'm doing yet, but I want this to be the coolest art show I've ever done in my life. And John Simpson, who's wonderful, he said, we can do that. Like they never missed a beat of anything I talked to them about. Like they just, I felt like I had a collaboration going rather than just here I am with ideas and pushing them out. They did a lot of test prints with me just so I could see how the materials worked. And I think they just kind of understood that I was exploring to see how it would work. And even a few of the mistakes on my end turned into pieces that worked out. So it just was very like, try it, kind of throw stuff
Yeah.
at the wall, try it. So
And they sort of sit down with you and kind of go through it with you. It's not
they
like you
literally
just
walked
send in.
me, yeah, they literally walked me around and showed me
Wow.
which printers. But I do have, again, like this history with them. And I brought students before. So I'd had tour groups go through. So I already knew.
Okay.
So I've had students tour with them, multiple students. And it's just been, every time I've gone, I'm always like, cool, that's a
Mm,
huge printer. You know, like that
yeah.
sounds funny. But the facility, I mean, they do everything from large scale magazines, and I mean, they can do, and they do the industrial size stuff. If you think about the materials that I worked with, it's not that uncommon when you start thinking about businesses. You think about, billboards, you think about those things. It's not that hard to believe, but so often we don't see it in an art context. So it takes that, and it's more common if you really start looking, but I wanted the industrial feel with some of the work. So it worked out.
Oh, that actually makes a lot of sense because that was part of it when I listened to your Neutrino Day talk and I was taking notes for this exact podcast. Um, I kept trying to figure out, okay, what is Simpson's printing like? Are they only industrial? So I like that you're kind of touching on they sort of do it all, and they just have this wide range. Now, do they cut your material as well? Like, are they the ones who help shape that into the hand?
So the hand, for those of you who are interested in learning the technical things, um, that's a vector-based image. In other words, I drew the shape, specifically using the pen tool in Illustrator. I drew the shape, and that is a separate layer from the layer that is the scanned, and it has been manipulated. I've digitally manipulated the cable slices. They do not look like that exactly. I teach digital media, so I'm just always sort of like, what'll happen if I do this in Photoshop? I mean, so I'm always curious
Hmm.
about if I push an image past what it started as. I did the same thing with behind me. This is a large scale. There is, that cosmos idea. I kept going back to these Hubble images. And as long as you cite what the Hubble image is, like you can use those in artwork. And so I looked at like copyright and how that would work. So I was really conscious of making sure I did this in the right way. So as I looked at Hubble, I was fascinated by this idea of this collective, like these images are for us, they're ours, like as
Hmm.
citizens. So that was sort of touching too. And I thought, we dream of the stars, we look out, we wonder, we ponder. And I did want to kind of tap into that a little bit in the artwork. And then the bacteria, like these tiny things that are almost invisible in juxtaposition of the largeness and the vastness. I was sort of fascinated by how quickly bacteria became clouds. I mean, it was just like, I don't know, I was having a good time making the work. I'll put it that way.
Oh, that's
So,
awesome.
yeah, it was really fun. And it was fun to think about. And I'll
Hmm.
admit, during COVID, I liked having the distraction, especially early on. So the fact that I had this art show and it was just like, nope, gotta work. That was good for me.
Absolutely. I never even thought about that you were having this to sort of take your mind off the craziness outside. I'm also really glad once again, I've known you for like 3, 4 years and never actually got to talk to you about the process of really any of the work you've done. And once again, I love now because I've seen the image of the hand now a few times through your website. I never connected that old and new theme, and I feel like Simpsons printing is kind of the ideal play. Like that business captures old and new, like you said, from big billboards that you've been seeing forever, or artistic new endeavors that we're seeing in the gallery. Like what a perfect. Thank goodness print Simpsons printing is in Rapid City because they sound really pivotal to this whole process and
I had
previous
a good
years.
time. Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say, and I
No, you're
had,
good.
I don't want to necessarily name just print shops, but I also had a good experience with working on other items, not necessarily for the art show, but other items. I worked with quick signs in spearfish as
Oh
well.
yeah.
So, I have to say, like, we have exceptional resources that are right here. Like, locally, Rapid, Simpsons, like I said, I've always just been blown away by the scale of the things that they can do. So this hand was various sizes, and we had it, like, I don't know, it was about, I think it was 1.5 feet or something, and which I thought was going to be the final size. And then I messaged them and I said, how wide can we go? And they said, well, the printer can go 4 feet. I said, let's do it. So they cut it out. I mean, and they put the backing. I mean, it was really remarkable. And there were a few pieces that I got when I saw it in person. This is, again, to no fault of theirs. It's a process thing. You look at it in person and it might have looked good on the computer, or vice versa. You're not sure about how it's going to look on the computer. And then you see it physically and it has a presence. I printed on metal and acrylic for almost every piece just to see which piece looked better. I didn't do that with the hand because I just somehow knew it needed to be glossy and shiny.
Right. Like that. So it's just constant process of try this, let's try this, let's try this.
And it there's a piece on the website that they are copper rings. And they're both square, and they're a diptych, so they're together. They're two pieces that are a pair. And that was I scanned a bunch of copper rings when I was underground, and I just kept thinking circles kept coming up, like planets, this idea of, like the Ray Davis ring that's in Lee. You can see it at the visitor center. Like, you could see this cool ring. That was a part of the experiment that he did, like 1960s. So that's another, like I said, go into that one. Yeah. But these rings kept popping up. So I thought, ooh, I want to do something with rings and circles. So that made me want to get metal prints. So it was like metal rings. I wanted it to be shiny. I wanted the pieces to be like, I wanted the light to capture it when you walked around it. So that's like a seed of an idea. If I did encourage young people, it'd be like, listen to the little idea and try stuff.
Yeah. And it's clear that's what's cool is that, the process that you've been doing from the beginning is the same process you're doing years later in these insane roles of, like, first residency at Sanford Underground Research Facility. Like, it's really cool I always really enjoy actually getting to hear the nitty gritty and the actual process. And, like, I mean, I'm sure it's overwhelming being down there, and then for you to capture these thoughts. So what does the future of Sanford Underground Research Facility look like? What kind of other opportunities? I know you've got a big announcement, and so I'm curious to kind of just hear about the future of what the surf artist in residency is going to look like.
Absolutely. So I must say that it was a wonderful experience, even with COVID. I should say that. And the way Sanford Lab just sort of pulled together Neutrino Day, which, if people don't know what that is, if you look it up, Neutrino Day is an annual celebration that's in Leeds, South Dakota. And then the last year, due to COVID, they pulled it online, and they did a remarkable job. Yes, as a part of that, I had a virtual reception for the art show. So physically, some of the pieces were in a space, and we walked around and I talked about the pieces. And then I also have a component of that, which is the website, which Kyler has been nice enough to say he'll put a link to. So that was sort of the end of what I was doing, with the exception of this art show that'll happen, the physical show. That was sort of the end of my residency. And I have to admit, I was really, like, bummed, because, I was like, this is like the coolest thing I've ever done, like, literally. And I do feel lucky to have done it. So again, there's a relationship between BHSU and the lab. So it was sort of, again, natural that the lab, saw an opportunity with me as a faculty member, and also someone who has been in done this a whole year. I wrote a document for them outlining what I think would be helpful, because I just kind of like documents and doing talks and things. I really do. So I really like organizing stuff. So I wrote a document about, here's what I think would be helpful for the next artist. And they already had plans too. I mean, it's not like they didn't, they did. But they asked if I'd like to stay on as the coordinator. So I'm no longer the artist in residence, but I am helping coordinate this year. So if artists are interested in having the coolest experience ever, I have to say, like, the lab opened the door around October. I think it was October 1st was the first day that they officially announced. There is a call to artists for the next artist in residence. So one person will be selected to come next summer. So summer 2021. There's a committee that will meet, and it's the final decision is made by the lab director. So I just want someone, whoever's out there who's thinking, man, that sounds like the coolest thing I've ever heard. We do have an open call. So if you go to the Sanford Lab site and you type in artist in residence, and I did send Kyler a link to this, the application and the information that you need is there. And I just, want to encourage artists that are interested. So it is, the deadline is December 1st. And if you have questions, my email at the Sanford Lab is surf_air. So Surf Air, which I think is a fun name.
It is.
So I can't say like how much it just, filled me up in like a sort of an intellectual way, an emotional way. I can't thank the people at Surf and, in lead and I mean, there's just so many people I want to thank. Like, I wish I could just sit here and name all of them. But I just had this wonderful experience, and I want to see other artists have it. And more importantly, I want to see what they're going to make, because I love looking at new art. So I'd love to see what the next person brings.
So, I mean, anyone out there listening who has just been loving what Gina's been saying, you can be in her shoes. And what I love, Gina, is that they're letting you be the coordinator. I love that, because, what better person who has been in both roles now to sort of, I mean, this could be a gift that just keeps on giving, right? Ideally.
I think the lab is so wonderful at planning for the long term. I've been impressed beyond measure. And, I've been in academia. I've been specifically at BH since 2008. And, when you see professionalism at a level that you're like, yes, they get it. And I felt that way in my role as a professor. And I feel that way in my role as someone who's been able to interact with the lab. I've just had, I can't say enough good about this experience. And I think that, there are these times in your life where you have opportunities. And, I think about Ray Davis approaching the Home State Company, or however that worked. I mean, we just don't know what one foot in front of the other will mean long term. So I think I want to encourage all those young artists out there who aren't sure, or even any field for that matter, just put one foot in front of the other.
I love that. That's sort of kind of been our whole theme of this conversation today, is just continue to keep taking risks and go for it. So just to recap, if you want to be considered, due date December 1st.
Yes.
And if they have any questions, they can go to surf_air at
sanfordlab.org.
That's
so
sanfordlab.org.
Yes, and that is all that information is on the Sanford Lab site. So if anybody has,
and I'll attach the links
yes,
too.
Yes, thank you so much, Kyler. This
Absolutely. Thank you. Is there any last things you want us to leave with?
Oh gosh, we're not all that different. Like if I could say any, like it's just, we're not that different. Sit down with a physicist at some point or something, or an engineer, and we're all talking and thinking about so many of the same things. We're just trying to get at them from different directions.
It's kind of a nice feeling, isn't it? Knowing that really at the end of the day, we're all sort of, yeah, I love that. Yeah. Well, Gina, thanks for having this wonderful conversation with me. Thanks for being a part of, the Matthews for all these years, and really everything you do to the community. You have been thanking a lot of people during this, but we also want to, thank you for continuing to stay curious and, these are the kind of big term projects that make this community, really as special as it is. So thank you.
Thank you guys for the work you do. Thank you for
Oh.
inviting me too.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and stay safe out there.